I'm putting in my own music this time. Justin's even dancing in the background to support us. All right, I think I think we're good and synced and live. We have fun around here. Welcome back to another episode of the Inner Tapestry Series with myself and Red Eagle. We are so glad to be back. Just to orient you, we've kind of taken an extended hiatus from doing this live because we were in the middle of launching Shadow Alchemy, which the book is out now. It is available, sharing wisdom from myself and Red and some other members of the Body of Nine community, as well as just some other incredible people. So that's where we've been, and it's here now. And so we're back.
Woohoo!
Woohoo!
Yes.
Finally! Every time Red was like, you want to do an episode this week? I was like, no, I can't. No,
No.
final edits, can't. No, no spoons. So I'm delighted to be back and having conversations with you, Red. It's always a pleasure. So if you would not mind just orienting our viewers to who you are and what you be and do in the world, that would be wonderful.
My name is Red MoonEagle, and I am a psychic catalyst. I am the healer's teacher, and I do a lot of things. Apparently, I write, and I do art, and I paint, and I work with students, and I do health coaching and life coaching, and I also do toxic mold and Lyme coaching, and I do a lot of things. So I stay really busy, and I love our conversations because I love how we dive into the meat of some really important topics that need to be spoken out loud in the world. And without that fear paradigm crushing and suppressing in the real world, right? Like that's that's why I love doing this. This is amazing. And thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you as always for being willing to have the conversations, right? Like that's something that you and I share that is a unfortunate rarity, but I think we're making more common, which is the willingness to look at the shadows and sit with the discomfort and to figure out what to do next. I posted, I was cleaning my house the other day. Justin and I were reorganizing a bookshelf. We just got a new bookshelf in, and so I was like going through old notes and whatnot, and I pulled out a sticky note where I had written something to the effect of, are you engaging out of, fear, pain, anger? I can't remember what words. It's literally on my Facebook status, but or are you engaging out of like love and compassion and curiosity and things like that? And it's, we are all of those things. We have all of those things within us. We experience all of those emotions. They move through, they flow. But where are we engaging from? And so that's where we're going today, because there is a big difference between engaging from fear and scarcity and shame and disappointment and blame and anger, and engaging from a desire for compassion, connection, curiosity, love, and whatnot. And so I'm seeing this in my life right now, my personal life. I see this with so many people, so many clients, that they they want to share their heart and soul and their pain and what's going on with them, or they have someone in their life that really wants to share that, but there's not boundaries around it. And so this came up like, oh, we should talk about this, because there's a difference between sharing in a really consensual, uh, loving, compassionate way and dumping. And Living Lughna, my brand, has tried to really create community spaces where we're open to the fact that there's uncomfortable stuff that goes on without trauma dumping or shame dumping or blame dumping or anger dumping or any of this. Like, so I'm curious, like, because Red, you're doing some coursework right now, and you've been writing more and sharing ideas about this. But what comes up for you as we start this conversation around the difference between sharing and the difference between trauma dumping?
Well, I think that for me, there's been a continual growth cycle in it, right? Like I growing up was taught how to trauma dump. That's how I was taught to share difficult things is that you share the difficult things by dumping it all onto the other person. And there was an expectation. I think this is the piece, right? Trauma dumping is that expectation of the other person to not only validate and hear what you said, but take it on. They need to feel it so deeply that they take it into themselves. And thus, you have shared that trauma so that they are then carrying the other part of that. And there is a big difference. I had to learn, and I had to learn it the hard way, that a lot of us have to learn it the hard way. I didn't have any tools on the, and I had to learn it to the point that I could, I stumbled into my tools. I stumbled into learning how to ask the question
Mm-hmm.
to the person that I'm communicating with. Hey, um, is it okay? Are you in an okay place for me to share this? Are you going to be okay if I share this? And also, part of the tools that I learned was completely by accident. One time, actually, was I was sharing, and the person in front of me, I didn't realize because I'm not an empath, right? And they were like, um, I feel really sick to my stomach and I just want to go home now. Like I was so horrified, and there was that moment of realization that I had completely overrided that person's boundary, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they were an empath, and I overwhelmed them energetically with my own emotions, with all my own trauma and my shit and all that other stuff, right?
Right.
And these are skills you can learn, but you don't. I think the big thing is that when you don't know, that's the difference. You don't know the difference between, oh, I'm going to go hang out with tea with my friend and I'm just going to dump all my shit on them, versus going out and having tea and asking, like, hey, how are you doing? Finding that equilibrium in the conversation, and then finding out, are you hanging out to just share space? Or are you hanging out to be there for that person? Or are they there for you? Did they reach out to you because they know you need that help? Like learning how to actually make that clear versus this assumptive dumping, right?
Yeah.
That people we do with each other. And the other layer to that, because I'm going to add another layer here, because I know you have this amazing counselor background that can untangle some of this, but there's also the layer of being told when you're growing up that communication in a broad term is you let that person speak and then you speak, and then you let that person speak and then you speak. They're taking turns, but nobody ever talks about it in an engaged way of, what the hell does that mean? Like, okay, there's a rhythm, but what if that person is just inundating you with their shit? How do you navigate that, right? Like,
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. And Ike just said in the chat, it's also a struggle when you want to be the person to hold the pain and then you realize you're unable to hold as much pain, even if they asked for consent and you gave consent. The shame of not having that capability is the roughness. Yeah. And so this is important.
yeah,
Consent can be given and taken, right? I can say,
yes,
hey, I'm open for this, and we can start, and then I can go, you know what? Actually, I don't have the capacity to hold all of this right now. Sorry that I've just realized that, and I would love to continue this conversation, but right now I need a little bit of an emotional break. Like we need to normalize that. And what I've been
yeah,
seeing coming up a lot is the person that wants to share so much is they want love, they want validation, they want care, and when they show up and they don't ask for that. They energetically ask for it without actually getting the consent piece going.
mm-hmm,
Then they self-fulfill the prophecy of not feeling loved, because then other people's response is, whoa, either whoa, stop, or like the person that just keeps trying to hold the space. And that's where I fell more than realizing I was unable to hold. I can hold a lot, but it was the I didn't give permission to hold, and there I am holding, right? And then so it's either whoa, or it's just you see the person's soul slowly leave their body because they didn't
Oh.
consent to, holding the energy. And it's not um when people have boundaries, it's not a lack of love. Boundaries are actually us saying, I so want to be in relationship with you. Here is how it is safe for me to be in relationship with you. And so a boundary is actually a gift. It's actually a sign of like,
Hmm.
hey, I really want this relationship with you. And if it keeps going down the path that it is, it's going to self destruct and I'm going to have to completely hightail it out of here. And
I think
especially
there's a layer. I think there's, especially for the dialogue of, because we've talked about energy sensitivity and empathy, and there's these undercurrents of communication between two empaths that an energy sensitive kind of knows something's happening, but they don't really know what that language is. And when I talk about the boundaries between the consensual engagement versus that dumping is also really reinforcing, encouraging people to use their words because there is an assumptive perception from your own meat suits experience that somebody else is just going to get it. They're not. They're really not.
Mm-mm.
and
Yeah.
and normalizing the vocabulary, normalizing, I was great with it, now I'm not, or yes, tell me more, let me hold more space for you.
Right. Yes. And consent is so not part of our mainstream right now, which is the scariest thing ever. Like let's just
Right.
acknowledge how freaking scary that is. So there's
Awful.
no need to shame ourselves when we have this aha moment. Like, oh my God, I have bowled into conversations or I've dumped on someone some really heavy stuff that I did not ask if they could hold. It's one thing like when I've been in the role of therapist and you come to me as a therapist or a guide, like now that I'm a guide instead, people still come to me with emotions, but there's an agreement automatically there because there's an exchange. You're coming to me with the intent that I am the container for this, right? Like that is the role. That
Hmm.
role is not everyone you meet on the street. That role is not your family members. That role is not always your best friend, right? That's where
Hmm.
the consent, like the consent's already pre-established in some kind of therapeutic or healing relationship within reason, right? Like I every time I go get my hair cut, every time I check in with my
Oh
stylist
yeah.
and I'm like,
Hmm.
so how bad's it been lately? Because people dump on their hairstylists all the time, right? They're a captive audience. They're cutting your hair and you just tell them your life story and they have no training on more than likely have no training on how to handle that. So they're just like, captive
Hmm.
audience,
Hmm.
right? And that's not a good feeling. But having the agreements creates the safety. And so I want to just like give an example of like what the difference looks like so that people can
Mm.
kind of figure that out. So if we're having a conversation and I'm like, "Hi Red, how are you?"
Hi, how are you?
Well, everything's on fire in my family right now, and I don't know how I'm going to keep it afloat. And oh my gosh, there's this thing happening with my sibling, and I don't know what's going to happen there. And I'm anxious all the time, and
would
right, like
would
just
you Yeah, and that's where the how are you, right, becomes the opening, and there's a space in there in a healthy way to say, for me to say, oh, it sounds like you're going through a lot. Would you like to share that? Would you like to share those details? Or that sounds like a lot. I also have a lot going on right now. Maybe let's talk about something else,
right.
right?
Yes. Versus like coming in from the get go and being like, "Hi, Red. I'm going through a really, really hard time with my family right now, and I really could use some emotional support. Do you have the time and capacity right now to do that?" And then you
Right.
get to say yes or no.
Yes
And your no
or
does not
no.
mean that I'm a terrible person and I'm unworthy of being listened to. It just means you are not the person to hold that space right now. So now I can go,
Mhm.
okay, well, thank you for trusting me with your boundary too. I'm really in need right now and I can't not focus on this. So I'm going to go call up another friend and see if they're available. Right? Like that's the line, and it's there's a pause. There's a deliberate pause of, do we both want to be engaging in this together?
Mhm.
Because that's, I think about when I used to attend a UU church. They did a part of the service where it was like you share a burden or a burden or a celebration, I think it was. And you would go up, and for like a celebration, you would put a rock in some sand, and then for a burden, you would put the rock in the water to purify it. And you would share with the congregation. There was an invitation to share the burden or share the celebration. And for the most part, people were very good with their burdens, and they would share like a sentence or two that would share that. But the consent was there, and then it was shared amongst the congregation. You knew that was going to be a part of the service because it was there every week, right? We don't always know when we walk into a conversation if someone else doesn't have those boundaries in place or knows how to look for other people's boundaries. We don't always know what we're getting ourselves into until we're in the midst of it. And a lot of us have this shame or guilt of drawing our own boundaries or stopping it from happening, right? Because as kids, we were captive audiences too.
I think there's a layer of cultural and societal mannerisms, and maybe this is my neurodiversity speaking into this, but I was confused for decades as the inanity of how you doing. Well, are you actually asking me how I'm doing, or are you asking because you don't know what to say? And
Right.
I get a sense that you don't really care, but you are saying it because you expect me to say something nice back. Like, oh, everything's fine. Like,
Everything's
it's as
great.
though there's an undercurrent of expectation that we're all pretending to be okay, and that's the status quo, which is so inauthentic, and I can't hold that space, and that just irritates me like no business. So
Hmm.
learning to navigate that too is part of learning how to recognize and create good boundaries. So when somebody who comes at me says, "Hey Red, how you doing?" I go, "I have learned that my kickback phrase is, well, every day is a new day." And because it is,
Genius.
right? It's both a positive statement and very interesting. Some people take it very negatively. They're like, "Oh, that's a terrible thing to say," or "Oh, yeah, I know, isn't it awful?" And I'm like, "Hmm, you went somewhere there that I did not."
Yeah.
Because this the boundaries aren't set up. As a culture, we do not have any healthy boundaries. And learning how to create those boundaries in your life teaches the people around you.
Hmm.
And I want to use an example. I've had I've done quite a bit of coaching, and there was a teacher many years ago that was on my leadership committee, and she was a young teacher. It was her very first year out of teaching school. She was 22. She was a baby teacher and a baby human, and she was in a very difficult school system with a brand new dynamic of socioeconomic class, a very different culture, a very different uh, historical background of her students. She just came from a totally different place. And she she had this project she wanted to walk the students through because she was very passionate about a very particular book. And as she was teaching it, she was finding that students were sharing that how much they hated the book. They absolutely hated the book. They hated the material. They didn't understand why they were reading it. They didn't have a cultural connection to why that book was supposedly so important and so fantabulous and all these things. And they were sharing their anger, their resentment, their frustration. And there was a there was a moment where I came in as a co-teacher to kind of, for lack of a better term, like kind of help her teach to that particular crowd. And we got almost through the whole lesson before she lost her cool. And when she lost her cool was because, and this is one of the reasons I was mentoring her, is because she had kind of lost her cool a couple times actually with this unit, and the students were coming to me on the other side of the school going, Miss A, we don't like this teacher. We don't, we don't feel like we're being respected. We don't feel like we're being heard. We don't get why she's angry, why she's frustrated. She's snapping at us, like she's taking it out on the kids basically, like it's
Mhm.
her stuff.
Right.
And we got mostly through the lesson, and she lost her cool, and she starts to kind of go down this trauma dumping avenue. And I, I, I gently said, hey, Miss Stevens, would you like to step out into the hallway and just take a nice fresh glass of water, and I'll take over here. I'll kind of help you with this. And she was like, yeah, fine, whatever, and like she stomps out, and she got herself calmed down. We circled back at the end of class, and it was a very interesting dialogue about teaching her how to recognize where she was spilling over in that environment.
Yep.
She had no idea. She had no idea that's what she was doing. She had none. No, it's not that she didn't have self awareness as a whole, right? But she's a very young human, young in teaching. I mean, she's only like 4 years older than some of her students, right?
Right.
And she had never had the conversation about what the boundaries are. None.
Yes.
As a
I
teacher, much less
uh,
as a human.
right. I love that term spillover though. I think that that's a really really good description and goes back to why it's so important for us to be willing to look at our shadows. Because what ends up
Yeah.
happening when we avoid them, we avoid our discomfort, we don't find the safe spaces to explore them, or we don't create them ourselves, is that it bubbles up over anyway. I used to use this metaphor with my therapy clients of like, ugh, we're just going to do a mini lesson on dissociation really quick. There's a spectrum of dissociation, and we all dissociate. Okay? You get into a minor fender bender. Your first
Mhm.
response is probably like anger and fear, like, oh my God, is my car totaled? And then you go, but wait, I'm okay right now. Is the person behind me okay? I need to go check. So you dissociate, you pop off the unpleasant emotion that you don't need to look at right now because you have other things to handle. And you go about your business and you get the insurance information, you call the police, and everybody's fine and dandy. And then ideally later that evening, you come home and you go, oh my gosh, to a loved one, something really scary happened today. Can I talk about it? And they go, yeah, tell me. And then you say, I got into an accident. It could have been worse, but I was so scared that it was worse. And you process it. And then that part comes back in and it integrates and all is well. The thing is that most of us in society have done that on repeat forever, where it's like, oh, there's another crisis. I can't feel the emotion here. So I'm going to keep popping off the emotions. And it gets to be like shoe boxes in a basement where you literally cannot put yet another shoebox in there because it has gotten so full that it just, you open the door and the shoe boxes start tumbling out. And that
Mhm.
spillover, when that happens,
Yep.
is overloading not just to you, but to everyone around you, because now there is no filter, there's no control, it's train off the tracks, just running. And that awareness, when we can become aware of that, can change the trajectory of our relationships, because we don't have to keep dissociating it. We find the safe spots to say, okay, this thing happened, can I talk to you about it? And people say yes, and people saying yes feels so much better than just
Mhm.
dumping. And if they
Yep.
say no, then we know that having dumped would have caused harm and friction in the relationship anyway. So we can be grateful that we preserved the safety of that relationship and know that we can come
Mhm.
back later and probably have the conversation at a later time. Versus when the spillover
Yeah.
happens repeatedly enough without awareness, people can start to pull back from relationships, which is what we're trying to go for in the first place by sharing, right? We're trying to have a relationship.
Right. Right. Well, shared experience, like the because there's another layer of and I go back to the neurodiversity part quite a bit with boundaries and trauma dumping versus engagement, right? Because
Mhm.
there is a quality of discussion, and I have learned to use very specific words when I'm sharing something that helps me connect with someone. I start off by saying, "Oh, I think I'm hearing this correctly. This is what I heard you say." And sometimes I get a validation, sometimes I get a no. And then I may use very specific words like, "I am going to now share my story of what I think this correlates to," right? Like I use those words out loud because I learned a long time ago that when someone is sharing and you're trying to create that connection, and me, neurodiverse person in the room, also not empathetic, I really don't feel what the other person feels. So unless I have an event that somewhat correlates, I don't know if I'm actually getting it quite right. And that can be very misinterpreted by a neurotypical person who thinks you're just talking about yourself. And there's a layer of when I need to create a boundary. I have and do still use a lot of words like I would really like to know, but I personally do not have that space, and I would like to connect with you at another time. I am saying out loud to you that now is not the time to me, not because I'm rejecting you. Like I have two very good friends that if they call me, I don't answer the phone until I text them and say, "Let me know, are we just going to chat, or is this more than this?" Because I have to prepare, because there is, on their part, there's no ability to filter
Right.
from that. There's no difference between I want to share and I'm dumping all of it onto you.
Right. Yes.
And I love them. I love them both. They're amazing individuals. It's just there's not as much subtlety to it, but there is a huge amount of cultural overlays on top of this that makes it a very sticky, almost um, minefield felt sense of I can't do any of this right. What are the tools that I need to navigate this properly?
Yeah. Yes. And Ike left a comment like, what boundaries for a society that was built on the foundation of colonization? Impossible. Like,
Yep.
yes, we have been
Right.
built on violation. Like, we are
Yeah,
founded on
we
just
have.
violating the heck out of other people's literal boundaries, like their physical
Hmm.
spaces. And yeah, like Ike also said, when we struggle with physical or sexual boundaries, emotional and verbal boundaries are even more confusing. And they said
Oh
for some
yeah.
reason, and I don't think that that's for some reason. Physical is like, this is my body, and if you can't respect
Hmm.
that this is my body, how are you going to respect that these are my emotions or this is my energy? The more subtle, unseen things. It's sort of that. It really is that 3D versus 5D, or the light versus the shadow, right? What's seen versus
Yes.
unseen. It's pretty obvious to us when somebody's boundaries are crossed physically, because you can see it.
Well, you say that. You say that, but and right? And I was just having this conversation day before yesterday with somebody where 20 something years ago, give or take a few, I was at a bar, I walked to my car, I was physically assaulted, I was harmed. There was danger, right? My physical body was put in danger, and the assumption was, but you're a strong female. That shouldn't have, you're fine. You survived, right? And now at my age, 20 something years down the road, there's even less safety for me to walk from an outside activity to my car safely.
Mm-hmm.
And there is even more discourse of whether or not somebody walking up to me in a dark parking lot, there is even more discourse of whether or not, should I make the assumption they're coming after me? 20 something years ago, I was told I should not have assumed that was going to happen because our world's a better place. And then when it did happen, because I survived it, everything should be fine. And
Oh, God.
right? So, right, like there are assumptions that are not, they're not actually tangible. They're not
Right.
real because in the real world for a woman, we aren't safe.
Mm-mm. We're not.
And the shadow that that is lingering in all of this is the assumptive presumptions that, well, women are in places, they're a CEO, or they can make this, or they have the potential to do that, they can do this, they can do that, so clearly the world's better.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Hmm.
Yeah,
And
definitely
not,
another yes
right?
and, right? Yes, and it's still not better. It's better, but
No.
it's not better. And I don't even know that it's actually better. There's
uh, yeah, there's a quality of the in talking about engaging, creating good boundaries, and dumping. One of the things that I think that we have this amazing opportunity with this discussion is to look at a little bit of history, right? So if you look at women's suffrage movement, right? Bringing women's right to vote, to own property, to have their own bank account, to divorce,
not that
look
long
at
ago,
the
by the
history
way.
of, correct, right? I say history, but I'm just kind of going to lean into a particular part of this, right? The assumptive shadow that people think of as the light, right, is this idea that we made it. And white women specifically, and I am going to bring race and sexuality into this, so white women specifically are sitting in this place of presumptive, we have made it. Okay? And the reality is, in the shadow, with trauma and historical sexual abuse, verbal abuse, drug abuse, oppression of women's rights, the I'm making blanket statements here, but like white women said, we've made it. We've made it better for all women. Okay. But they didn't really, as a culture, white women were not dealing with, well, you've ignored the black women, you've ignored the indigenous women, you have ignored Asian women, you have ignored their stories, you have ignored their contribution and need to be right there with you. And you have not dealt with that shadow. You have not dealt with that trauma. You have not dealt with that historical, endemic, racist, classist, sexual perception, right? And are you, as a white woman, also willing to embrace the transgender woman? Are you willing to embrace the lesbian woman? Are you willing to embrace all of the variations of women and accept their power and their light into these spaces? So no, you're not. And because you're not willing to do that, you have decided that, oh, we made it, and all these other women should just accept that we've made it. We don't have to fight anymore. We don't have to fight for our rights anymore because we made it, right? So we can sit back and we can say we've done it. And thus, that's why it hasn't gotten better. It hasn't gotten
Right.
better because now, especially the last 10, 15 years, people like you, Safrianna, people like Ike, people like, oh, I could list a whole bunch of people, myself included in that, are, you know, not only did we not make it as a whole, half of the population of the earth, right? Not only did we not make it, but we stopped because we were not willing to deal with our trauma of class, of racism, of all of these dynamics. And now that we're in a place where everybody's panicking, oh my God, we're losing our rights, we're losing our rights. What? How did we get here? How did this happen? Blah 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 blah. The
Wonder.
reality is that, right? The reality is that all of these women who have been on the fringes, who have didn't make it. I mean, there's no equity in this, right? There's no real equity in this, and all of these women's voices are rising up, saying, "Well, this is why. This is why we're here," and a lot of this is creating these dynamic spaces of conversation to figure out how to engage with these traumatic, difficult conversations, these endemic, racist, classist, pick a topic, because I can never say all of the little thingies
Right.
coherently.
I say the isms,
And
right? The isms and the
the
phobias.
isms, right. Yes, the isms and the phobias. Perfect. And now the dynamic is, well, we need to fix it. Okay, but you can't fix it without having these conversations. And
Correct.
you can't fix it without dealing with the big feels of your own ownership of that trauma and learning to discuss it in a safe way
Yep.
and be okay with the discomfort and the fear and the shame and the disappointment, and that it's okay to have all these feelings. And I know this probably seems like I went sideways with it, but there's a reason why this discussion comes up often around these isms, right?
Hmm.
So this man treated me this way. I'm having all these problems with the men in my relationship. Okay, there's an ism in there, right? I'm having this problem with this person who comes from a different culture and I don't understand. Well, there's an ism in there, right? Like, none of this is in just your personal story of isolation. It's
Right.
also the connection. And how do you have these conversations healthy? And how do you do it? What are the tools, right?
Yeah, and I had to Google in the background because I wanted to make sure that I was sharing the right name and date. But you're basically speaking into our continued need to acknowledge intersectionality or intersectional
Yes,
feminism. And
thank you.
Kimberly
Intersectionality.
Crenshaw, yes,
Yeah,
Crenshaw was a lawyer or a law professor who
yes,
coined the term in 1989, and I learned about the
yep.
term in college, and I was like, oh my god, finally the answer. Like, because we all have trauma. 100% of us have trauma. It can't be alive on this planet. Birth is a trauma in of itself, right? The
Yep.
process of being born is really not a pleasant one. Um,
Hmm.
and we all have these different intersections of things. And when we make these assumptions, well, oh, you're a white man, or you are a man in general, or you are a woman, or you're straight, or you're this, or you're that, when you only look at one thread in someone's full story, you're missing so many things that are also potentially there, right? Like, there are plenty of white men who grew up in poverty and
Hmm.
experienced sexual trauma, for example, just to throw out a
Hmm.
niche. Now, are they going to have an easier time out in the world getting a job because they're a white man? Absolutely. But are they going to have mountains to climb internally because of their experiences? Also, absolutely, right? Versus there may be a
Yeah.
black woman out there who somehow, by virtue of upbringing, and just happening to have a family that got out of the ongoing awful situations, maybe didn't experience some of those traumas, but is still going to go out in the world and face discrimination by virtue of the color of her
Yes.
skin. So it's like all of these things, if we don't talk about them, we also can't appropriately share the burdens, because as you were talking, what I kept thinking was collective trauma. One of the reasons, and I've talked very openly about this on podcasts and stuff before, is my relationship with racism. Because I grew up in upstate New York. There were no black people in my neighborhood, period. Like I didn't see a person with darker skin than mine until I was in, it was either kindergarten or first grade, and a girl moved in, a black family moved into the neighborhood, and a bunch of the other white families all of a sudden started treating her differently. And I was like, huh, that's weird. Well, cool, new person. And I'm a natural number 9. So, of course, I was like, come in, you're my bestie now. And I didn't see any issue because my family didn't talk in a racist way around the house. I hadn't heard it. Then we moved to Maryland, where there was racism everywhere. Not quite as bad as the time when I lived in Tennessee, where it was dinner table like casual racism, which I did not last there very long. But Maryland, I started to see it, and the schools were very, very mixed in Maryland. White, Hispanic, Black, Asian, like melting pot, like genuine melting pot schools. But I started hearing other kids talking in racist ways, and then that turned online my genetic history of racism, which none of us can escape. It's there. It's in our culture right now.
It's there.
And when it's passed down for generations, it's there, and it comes online just like an illness, just like a cancer, right? You get the right conditions and whoop, the switch is flipped. So if I can't share the burden of my experience of then having these thoughts, I can't also heal from them. So I have to be able to acknowledge it to heal from it. I can't avoid it. I can't shove it in the shoebox in the basement. I have to bring it into the light. The shadow, the very uncomfortable thing of like, why am I feeling different about a person based on the color of their skin? When in my past, this was not the case. Oh, because collective trauma is here for me to work on within myself. So if we're unwilling to look at these shared burdens of collective trauma, we're doing a disservice to all of the people who are experiencing these things on a daily basis, because it exists within us all. We are a collective. We're a shared species. We're a communal species. And yet there's still a difference between the sharing and the dumping that we still need to fine tune. And I wonder if that's, when I think about, like, I don't have any problem at all with the Black Lives Matter movement. I will keep on keeping on, like, go for it. But I wonder if that was part of like people's big responses to it, is like, you're bringing it into my face and I don't want you to, right? Because they're so avoidant. And then, this group of people being like, we need to look at this. We need to look at this. And people being like, no, I don't want to, right? But we need to with these big things.
Yeah. Well, there's when we're looking at engagement, creating good boundaries, and learning how to communicate those layers of trauma, I think there's a lot of tools. Like, one of the big tools that you and I talk about quite a bit is Body of 9. Like, what is your personal natural number place of power? Like, where is your aligned and unaligned places in your body? And then the layers of that do come through that are that collective trauma, because that's going to come through the lens of your body's filter system, right? And then also making sure that we are using words, not just emoting, those lovely empaths who are just emoting at everybody, or the energy sensitives who are pushing the energy on people because they don't even know that they're doing that. Been there, done that, got that t-shirt, right? Like, recognizing who you are and what are your tools, where's your alignment, and where are you unaligned, and using the tools with that, and being able to be authentic in that communication. I think there is a place that when you're learning how to create a good boundary, and you're learning how to engage, there is a piece of language that sometimes there's this, well, do I say it that way? Do I say queer? Do I say lesbian? Do I say gay? Do I say LGBTQ? Do I say black? Do I say African American? Do I say Native American, or do I say indigenous person? Like there's a language subtlety that sometimes can feel very much like that minefield, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is a piece of language that becomes less slippery, ironically. Like there's more anchoring and being authentic in the moment and being able to communicate things. If you understand and honor that each person's natural number is their own, their gifts are their own, their frequency is their own, whatever it is in their blueprint, and you can honor that because you're honoring your own, right?
Yeah.
Then you can come into a place of, if you're working on being aligned and you can recognize that that person is working on being aligned, you have less of a minefield, even with a
Yeah.
difficult subject. Like,
Right.
I mean, I think you and I are probably a really good example of that, Safrianna. Like there is a understanding that you have that I am aligned with as much as I can be aligned with. I accept and recognize and see that you're aligning with all the things that you're aligning with. So even if we say something that there's like one word that, there's a dissonance there, or that could be kind of hurtful, there's no judginess with it. It's more
Mm-hmm.
of a, oh, I have now a question. What do you think of this? Or this is what I think of when you say that. Do I have that right? Like there's an understanding of the play of shadow and light in that communication, but also a
Yes.
healing process without it being a, gosh, I'm really struggling with this intersectionality of racism and my own heritage. Here, I'm just going to dump it all on you. And you're going, that's a lot.
Whoa, I needed to anchor into something here before we got started on that, right? Like, well,
Yeah,
big topic, right? Yeah, and that
right, right.
invitation of, can we have the difficult conversation together instead of,
Mhm.
we're not gonna have a conversation. I'm just gonna at you and you're gonna hold space. It's not your choice. I have taken all the control in this situation unless you physically leave, which unfortunately a lot of these kinds of situations happen when someone cannot physically leave, right? They're in a car or they're they're in a classroom, right? Getting dumped on by the teacher or, whatever the
Oh,
situation might be. Where
yeah.
the other person, like, they needed that room. And I love the, especially when talking about natural numbers, like, we all do use words differently. But when we have established we're having a consensual conversation and we're going to anchor it around this topic, there's automatically more willingness to um, sit through those challenging moments because you've agreed to have a conversation. So you're agreeing to, okay, well, they said that and maybe I don't agree with that, but I can share that in a bit if I need to, if it's still relevant. Um, Ike said, are people trauma dumping their desperate attempt to put their burdens into the light, but the desperation's unaligned and then it doesn't get resolved? Yeah. So when we trauma dump,
Hmm.
we're trying to bring the shadow into the light so it's not in the shadow anymore. But we're doing it in an unaligned way. So it's just more unaligned light, right? That's the thing. And I can't wait to write more about this because a lot of people have looked at my chart in shadow alchemy and they're like, oh my God. I'm like, don't worry, a whole book is going to come where we're just going to talk about that stuff for like chapters
Just
because
that stuff. Yep.
just that stuff because the aligned versus unaligned is so huge. And that's the thing with this, sharing burdens is aligned, trauma dumping is unaligned. So when I come forward and I say I have a burden, it is very heavy and I need somebody to share it with, are you willing to share it with me? And you say yes, that is in alignment because we have agreed and the energy is therefore moving smoothly together, right? We're able to flow and
Hmm.
we're holding the weight and there's balance. Yay. When you trauma dump, right? This person's chilling here and you come in and There's no flow with that. You have just bowled them over, and now the energy is all wibbly wobbly and out of alignment because the two people didn't agree to a balance, right? Or the room full of people didn't agree to a balance.
There's another layer of this too, and that's that karmic swirl. And part of, I think, to come back to a little piece of that, when they're dumping their desperate attempt to, yes, bring that shadow into the light, if somebody's not ready, there is a karmic thread that can be grabbed up by the other person. And then that you end up with one person who's swirling around and around and around in this karmic swirl pool of trauma, 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 trauma. And they have now grabbed at the threads of the people around them, whether that be a group of people or that person you've dumped on. And there is this tendency for someone that's maybe on the edge of their own trauma that's similar to that, where they get then an additional energy push to swirl around their own karmic swirl. Mm-hmm. And then you have two people doing their karmic swirls together, but it's their own individual thing, but right. it can feel the same. And it can also create this karmic unalignment that then swirls into other things. It's very much like that ping pong ball that's covered with a little bit of peanut butter, and one person ping pongs into the other one, and then the peanut butter gets smeared on that one, and then it smears on another one, and next thing you know, all your ping pong balls are covered in peanut butter. I mean, a little oily and sticky, and it gets on everything. I like to use visceral descriptions for karmic stuff, because karmic stuff is for many people part of what they're not even understanding that they're swirling. And if you make it kind of like a visual, visceral, tangible thing, then it becomes a little bit more, yeah, that's the part I'm trying to get out of. That I can now recognize that felt sense of, oh, you mean I don't have to feel sticky and gooey? Oh, I'd like to not feel sticky and gooey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's no resolution in that, ultimately.
No.
Because now everything's just sticky and gross.
Yeah. And it smears everywhere. It spills over and it smears into everything else, all the interactions you have with everybody around you. You and I have talked about people that we've encountered that they're so in their swirl, they're so in that karmic repeat pattern that they'll even say things like, I just don't understand why it happens all the time. Okay. Can you explain to me your right? Well, this is the challenge, right? Like, can you explain to me what you are feeling? And most of the time, they do explain it very much in that peanut buttery, smeary way. If you ask them, they'll use terms that are very like, it's a felt sense of that swirl, that everything's messy and nothing is clear, and they can't quite untangle it. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no shame. There's no reason to be afraid or disappointed in that journey. The way out of that karmic swirl is recognizing that when someone points out, hey, where is that unalignedness, right? That's where you lean back into the tools and you go, okay, clearly something's not aligned. Clearly I'm not getting something, but not from a place of fear, shame, disappointment. I'm not getting something because I need to realign something, whatever that is you're trying to realign.
Right.
And then you do get clarity. you do get clarity, and then you are able to see that repeat pattern coming at you. Oh, I can see it. It's coming at me. What am I going to do differently, right?
Yeah.
The,
Yes.
there's a lot of work with this, and it's a gift that we can give to each other by starting the journey of using communication, using new words, using a pause, a breath, a moment, a felt sense of being with each other in a new way, and journeying through to the other side of that fear paradigm that we don't have to live in. We don't
Hmm.
have to live there.
Yep. We don't. And this is just one little, thing in the journey. Well, it's a big thing actually. Our communication's pretty big because we need to be in community, and that's why Red and I are having these conversations. But,
Yep.
ultimately remember that sharing is a gift, and we
Mm-hmm.
share with people who want us to share, right? If I'm like, hey, I'm eating this tangerine, you want a piece? You can say yes or you can say no. If I force the piece of tangerine in your mouth, you're going to be very upset with me, even if you ultimately wanted a tangerine. Like, you don't want me forcing it on you, right? And it's such a like, when we look at it in that physical way, sometimes it's easier to understand how energetically, verbally, emotionally we can cross people's lines. And if they ask us to slow our roll, it's not because they don't love us, it's because they want to actually be able to receive us, and they can't in the way that we're coming in. And I'm speaking from experience. I remember in my 20s, like, I would just immediately tell everybody all the shit that I thought they needed to know about me so they could determine if they'd love me or not. And so I
Mm-hmm.
just lead with
Yep.
the darkest shit. Just lead with it. And then I started to realize, that's actually making them run away really quickly, versus as I aged and noticed that pattern, I would start to say, "Hey, I have some dark history, and it brings up a lot for me, and it does impact my relationships because it's relational trauma. uh
Mm-hmm.
how much detail do you want to know about those
Mm-hmm.
things?" And then I would let them tell me. And some people, I know Ike's over there probably like thinking of themselves, because there were times in our early relationship where I would ask for that and they'd be like, "Tell me." And then, with all their bright-eyed
Oh
awe and
shit.
wonder, they would not realize what was about to come out of my mouth, and then I'd say it and they'd be like, "Oh my god, that's way darker than I ever thought it could be," right? Because their life framework was just different. And that's okay when that happens too. And we're allowed to go, whoa, whoa, like,
Yeah.
maybe I wasn't quite ready for this yet, or that's enough detail for me for right now. Thank you. Right. And other people might
Yeah.
feel rejected or upset, and that's okay too. Because there
Yeah.
are
It
places
is
they can go
okay.
say those things, like therapy.
Yeah. I mean, I think that might be why I tell pretty much every client I've ever had, make sure you have a counselor.
Yep. So important to have a person where you can unburden completely. Um, and yeah. And we will have those people that are just friends or family members that, with consent, we can do that too. But the consent is so key. I'm sure we're going to keep having conversations like this into infinity now that we're back and our project is over. But I think this was a great glimpse into it for today. So thank you, Red.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Always.
Is there anything else that you would want to share on this topic for today before we say goodbye?
No, I think that, the ongoing discussions, I mean, I think that Shadow Alchemy, bringing up the book, that big project we worked on, I think it's a nice snapshot of, it's a microcosm of the macrocosm of women in looking at shadow from the myriad of perspectives in our culture. And there's some very good tools in that book to look at what and how we navigate. trauma, shadow, and the journey into healing
Mm-hmm.
and into light. So I, there's so much that even though we talked about keeping this topic to boundaries and learning how to engage and talking about that, it is a very layered topic. And if it feels like this was a lot, for those of you that are listening out into the future, you're right, it is a lot.
Yep.
And and it's important. And anything that you as an individual can do as you learn to navigate that in your life then demonstrates and shows to your brothers and sisters in this community on the world that we live on within, then that means we're all working towards the same thing. Going to a place of shame, disappointment, fear, why does it matter? Why should I try? Why should I even bother trying to change this? Handicaps everyone around you because it doesn't give everybody the opportunity to participate in that learning process. We
Right.
need, we all have to step up to the plate, all of us, to change the world because that's what we're doing.
Absolutely. And it starts within, which is why we want you to look within and figure out these patterns so that you can be liberated from them and the collective can be
Mm-hmm.
liberated from them through each individual's work. So,
Yes.
ah, so good. We'll be back in 2 weeks talking about another topic. If you have follow up questions, if you are like, oh my gosh, I want to hear these two talk about something in particular, leave us a comment, shoot us an email. Our websites are below. You can figure out how to get in touch with us. We're here to, help serve the collective and coming into better community, like stronger, more loving, compassionate, open community where we can share these burdens, right? Like we're not here saying never share the burden with anybody. We're saying just do it in a way where everyone can be on the same on the same wavelength, really, ultimately. So, all right. Until next time, friends, we will be back soon. We love you. We see you. We believe in you. We're all doing the work together.